the process of putting this together was very much just to contact a lot of people that we thought had an interest with Hepworth or had been interested in Hepworth, and ask them for their ideas on short 10-minute papers. And then we tried to sort of group them together in ways that might make sense and either be kind of complementary or in some ways sort of juxtaposed in a way that might offer up new interpretations. So by no means are these sort of themes in any way sort of fixed or dictated. They're more sort of loose ideas. So this first one on surface is going to be chaired by Penelope Curtis. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Penelope, who's currently director of the Museo Carlos Gulbenkian in Lisbon, previously director of Tate Britain and head of sculpture studies at the Henry Moore Institute. And I'm sure all of you know Penelope and her work on Hepworth, in addition to many papers, essays, books on Hepworth. She's also curated two of the most significant exhibitions of Hepworth's work in recent years, the 2015 Tate Britain show with Chris Stevens and also the 1994 Tate Liverpool show. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Penelope. Thank you very much.
There are brief biographies at the back of the paper, so I don't need to say a lot, but just to set the scene, we've got three people here talking, I suppose you might say from different generations, and also representing, interestingly, maybe not actually, but in different ways, some of the key institutions that have been connected with this topic, that is to say the Tate, the Henry Moore Foundation, the Henry Moore Institute. These people connect in different ways to my own biography, which you just outlined. So Chris Stevens is currently the director at the Holborn Museum in Bath, but previous to that was working at the Tate, firstly when it was the Tate and then became Tate Britain, and did the Hepworth show, as you mentioned, with me, but perhaps most significantly did the big catalogue of the Tate's collection of Barbara Hepworth with Matthew Gale. And Derek Cullen I first knew when I worked with him on the 1994 Barbara Hepworth show at Tate Liverpool. And Derek was also at the Tate for a long time, but then has left to become an independent conservator, with Jackie Human, who did the From Marble to Chocolate book that was mentioned before, which was a great conference. I was there. And then finally, Hannah Hyam, who I've only just met, but who's now at the Henry Moore Foundation and has been there for 4 years. And she said, I'm not a Henry Moore person, really. I come from a different background. I think that's good. That's great. And you worked previously on Renaissance terracotta, so you bring a material background to the study of sculpture. And I think what I've always liked about sculpture is that it does include people from different periods and allows a kind of wider range so that people from different backgrounds can still think about one object together from different perspectives.
Thank you for the invitation to speak. I feel, slightly weirdly kind of nervous about this. I feel like for the last 15 years, I give talks to old ladies in museums and exhibitions rather than talking to experts on subjects. And I was thinking last night how it feels like an awful long time since I did research on Barbara Hepworth. So as the show we did together was less than 5 years ago, I probably shouldn't say that out loud. But a lot of the research actually for that show was done by Inga Fraser, so we should name check her as well as her contribution. So when I was asked if there was anything I wanted to talk about, I couldn't really think of anything. And then I thought there's a sort of interesting body of late work by Hepworth where she uses sort of radically different kind of stones is what particularly came to my mind, which I thought no one's really sort of paid attention to. And then actually, again, just in the last few days, as I sort of paid attention to it, I realised that Matthew Gale and I talked about it a bit in the book we did in 2000, and actually it was a feature in the centenary exhibition, the St Ives bit of the centenary exhibition, which I curated. So I'm sorry, I was going to say I'm sorry if I'm repeating what other people have said, but I'm sorry if I might be repeating what I've said myself and forgotten. So sorry about that. Okay, now let me just get on top of the PowerPoint, just the arrow. I know, I should, yeah. Just to make the point that, the material that is synonymous, I think, with Hepworth in particular is white marble. It runs through her career from the certainly from the 1930s right through to the very end, the very last sculpture. And that was drawn out actually in the centenary shows, where the final room of the St Ives exhibition was it was called, I think, Interrelated Masses, and had works from the 30s and the 50s, but all about white marble pieces in some sort of three-dimensional relationship. And then the Yorkshire Sculpture Park section of that centenary celebration included a large group of the later white marble. So you see the white marble running through her career, and certainly in the 60s it became very much one of the prominent parts of the way people wrote about her and talked about her. There are a series of interviews, people, including Paul Hodin, going to interview her in the garden and commenting on the relationship between the Cornish climate, the white marble, and a sort of Mediterranean sensibility. And then famously, some of her last works, her very last works, Fallen Images, they're showing here Assembly of Sea Forms from California, were a sort of conglomeration of pieces of white marble. So it's very much sort of, a lot of her work, I think, depends on the monochrome quality, as well as marble. Of course, she also uses dark wood, and in particular in the 30s, her work seems to rely on that sort of monochrome nature, because it seems to be so particularly about that interrelation of masses, very much about how two or three solid objects relate spatially to each other. So it's about volume and mass and space. I mean, I think even with those single forms, and there was a white marble version of those, which was lost, she seems to be using the monochrome to sort of throw our attention more on the kind of spatial qualities than on the material and the pattern. There's an absence of pattern, I suppose, in a lot of the works that we think of. And yet in the last years, the last decade of her life, I suppose, you see her really kind of reveling in a sort of new, particularly new stones, and seems to be sort of seeking out the ones with the most kind of incident, the most surface pattern. And I think, though, the interrelation of masses and volume and space remains a kind of ongoing concern, there is also a kind of celebration in surface patterning, which seems very different to her early work. You see it here in Two Rocks. It's a wonderful sculpture. And you see also this amazing diversification of materials. So having worked for most of her career with quite a small range of woods and stones, I mean white marble and a few indigenous stones, you suddenly see a huge range of different materials. So here on the left is serpentine. I don't know if serpentine marble the same as serpentine, conservators amongst us. I always thought serpentine was green. Anyway, that's how it's listed. And then this sort of pink, the Portuguese pink marble piece is pinker than it looks in that slide. And this amazing Swedish marble, which, as you can see, this is one of the earlier sort of uses of these sort of new, much more sort of stratified pattern stones, where she's sort of then articulated by painting those surfaces. Always seems a really strange thing to do, to paint a stone sculpture, but it was something she'd done in the 40s repeatedly. And it almost like she's sort of throwing attention onto the surface and of these areas of these sculptures, as if sort of defying the kind of the monochrome quality of the material. I mean, obviously they're not perfectly monochrome. The piece on the right is Hopton wood stone, so it does have a sort of granular, varied quality, but nothing like those later stones. So in a sense, that use of paint is going back to this earlier moment where for sort of 3 or 4 years she was applying paint to stone carvings. And they obviously were coming out of the wooden pieces that she'd started in the 1940s, and this is the first of the wood carvings she made, having not carved for a couple of years during the Second World War, where she's developing this sort of key theme of her work, which is about the internal space of the block. So having made works where it's the sort of space between masses, this is now sort of opening up a space within the mass of the sculpture. And I guess this is the first time, in a way, the surface starts becoming a really kind of key element in what the sculpture's about. The way she, if you think about what this sculpture would look like if she didn't paint any of it, she kind of helped, one of the things that creates that sense of a space, a hollow space within a sort of outer crust, if you like, rather than a block that's been drilled through, is the way she paints the inside, as it were, and leaves the outside as bare wood. I can't remember what's coming next now. The first sort of move in the 60s into a sort of more diversified kind of range of stones comes with her use of slate, which I was told, one of the really interesting things that Matthew Gale and I did when we were cataloguing the Tate's collection of Hepworths was interview all the surviving assistants. It was a very bizarre experience because they were all in very sort of different circumstances. Some were working artists, and one guy was sort of in a hospital bed in his front room, and it was about 95 degrees. We sort of, we couldn't think what to say because it was so hot. But one of the stories we learned from that, and how accurate this is, I've never been able to check, that we didn't have as much sort of, as full access to the archive at that time as we do now, was that her first slate pieces were made when the assistant salvaged an old billiard table that had been thrown out from the billiards club in St Ives, just down the road from the studio. I don't know whether that's true, but it is true that a lot of these slate elements are about the same sort of thickness, kind of, I don't know, 1.5 inches, I think. Conversely, I was told, we talked to Henry Gilbert, who was a local architect and a friend of Hepworth's, who I think claimed that he had introduced her to slate. He certainly introduced her to the Delabole slate, he said. He had used it for flooring in some of his buildings. And he encouraged her to use the sort of the slate from deeper in the quarry, which is much blacker. And that's the quality you see here. And she obviously sort of embraces and celebrates the kind of intense blackness of the slate once it's polished. And one of the things I think these pieces drew out was her sort of pragmatism and the sort of economy of means, that these are actually very simply made. The slate you can sort of cut with a saw and then fairly easily round off the edges. The assistants termed that pebbling, because you turn something which is hard-edged into something which looks like it's been sort of weather-worn. And often the work at the bottom, which is very small, they said would have been made using the corners that have been cut off when making a larger piece. So if you think of those sort of large slate pieces which have sort of rounded tops, the triangles would have been the first pieces to be sort of sawn off to start making a more organic shape. And you see in this piece how she then uses the blackness of the slate and the whiteness of the marble to create contrast. And I think one of the interesting things about this piece, which from here is completely invisible, is that she uses two different white marbles. So the kind of small white marble element in the middle is much purer white, more like the marble she used in the 30s than the large sort of bowl form, which has a sort of grey patterning in it, which shows, I think, how conscious she is of the contrast between the different sort of materiality of the stones that she's working with. And that fits in then with this sort of phenomenon. You see a whole series of works from about 1965, I think, where she starts using lots of different marbles. I think there's a lot of correspondence, others can correct me if I'm wrong, with more than one quarry in Ireland, where in Connemara, for example, where some of these green and grey marbles come from. And you can see how she uses them. She comes back to this idea of sort of two forms in spatial tension, but uses the different materials and the different surface qualities, I think, to amplify that sort of sense of tension. But, oh, right, okay. I wasn't expecting that. So, yes, she does that several times, using different stones. But then also you see her with single pieces, and it almost looks like she's seeking out stones which have as much variation in them as possible. So this is Ancaster stone, the same stone actually that is in hieroglyph in Leeds City Art Gallery that Laura showed. And this is touchstone. Annoyingly, this official view doesn't show that around the other side of this, there's an amazing speckling of white pieces, which is a sort of shell form in the marble. And the correspondence shows that she asked the quarry to send her pieces with as much shelly patterning as possible. So it's really interesting that she's very obviously, explicitly seeking something which isn't plain and monochrome in the way that she had preferred in her earlier life. And obviously this sort of echoes changes in other materials. So you see, while she continues with making bronze, she also starts working with aluminium. I think this might be upstairs, is it? And clearly painting the surfaces. So this sort of colouring of the surface is again throwing as much attention onto the qualities of surface and finish as on the sort of spatial and volumetric qualities. And I think her, in a way, this is sort of first seen in this, what seems always used to seem to me quite sort of counterintuitive use of really polished bronze. I used to think these were awful. I kind of quite like them now. Where the sort of reflectiveness of the surface, I think, amplifies the importance of surface over mass in a way quite different to the original carvings. And it's interesting that you see in several instances her developing the two ideas in parallel. So this is shaft and circle, and the bronze follows almost immediately upon the stone carving. And then that sort of, the impact of different materials on a single idea is really striking. I mean, it's amazing, I think, the transition she made from that sort of truth to materials doctrine. And I think Hepworth, more than other artists, particularly Henry Moore, found it hard to abandon those early principles. But you see her kind of, this is a stone carving from 1935, which she had the presence of mind to cast in plaster before it went to New York that year, and then cast it in aluminium. I have to say, the aluminium's dated 1935 as well. I've always been deeply sceptical that it was pre-war, but I have absolutely no evidence to justify redating it. And then she casts it in badly in Cornwall. There's a nice anecdote about the casting of the first bronze version. The foundry in St. Just used to throw old taps into the mix, and all the chrome would melt off, and the assistants, as they sort of ground down the surface to polish it and take off the wood, they keep breaking their rasps because they'd hit a little bubble of chrome in the surface. And you can see there, I think, there's lots of dots where they've had to fill in those holes left by the chrome nuggets. And then it's completely transformed, I think, when in its sort of raw, polished form. So that's it. I think the idea there was simply a sort of, but really fundamental shift, I think, from an emphasis on mass, volume, and space to something which is also about surface that you see in the patterning of stones and the reflectiveness of metal. Thank you. Sorry, that was more than a minute.
Hello. I'm going to talk about Hepworth's wood sculptures from my conservator's viewpoint and about a couple of the opportunities I think there are for further research. And let's see. Okay. Well, we could start by identifying the woods themselves to be sure we know exactly what we're dealing with. We need to know this so as to address a less recognised problem, which is the gradual structural deterioration that occurs as these woods age. Hepworth knew well enough that wood responds to changes in humidity, but she probably didn't foresee the cumulative effects of decades of cycles of small expansions and contractions. Wood is resilient, and up to a point, it can swell and then shrink back a little. But it can be strained to cracking point by conflicting changes, and that is when you get uneven expansion and contraction. We need to know how the woods used in the actual sculptures respond to changes in their moisture content, and how we can anticipate and prevent strain on the vulnerable parts of the sculptures so as to avoid failure. And by failure, I mean, irreversible cracks and splitting. I tried to count how many woods. I haven't tried, rather, to count how many wood sculptures Hepworth carved, although Sophie says it would be easy to look at her database. But I did jot this list down in no particular order of the woods she is listed as having used. And they may not all be different. For example, basswood and lindenwood, they're both lime. Hepworth says she preferred the resistance of tropical hardwoods, which make up more than half the list, but these were impossible to source during the war years and soon after. And I see a list of paddock, which was used in the Discinetulon, and I'm sure there are others. But it's a huge number. I've highlighted the elms. I thought elm was elm, and that these three names were simply descriptive names of the same species, but I was wrong. Cornish elm, grey elm, and broadleaf elm are actually different wood species, presumably with similar but slightly different characteristics. Do these woods look and behave differently from other elm species, such as, for example, the English elm? Are they perhaps misnamed? Until recently, we've had to be content with visual identification of a wood by its colour, grain and pore patterns. But concerns over illegal logging and the lack of genetic diversity among trees has led to the development of DNA testing. And that's now capable of identifying a species and going far beyond that, down to identifying timber from the same tree. So that's a direction for future research. It's a very staged studio photo, this, but nonetheless interesting. I like the way she says the Himalayan rosewood, which I found through friends in Devonshire, had a kind of jungle-like ferocity. It's romanticising a very hard and long process of carving, but she sort of gives personality to the wood. And Dryad, the form that is in the centre there, is now in Edinburgh. She also says about the Cosden head on the left that it proved to be a singularly intractable metamorphic rock. Now in Edinburgh. So cracks are inevitable, and I think by 1971, they would have started to show in almost all her wood sculptures. Hollow form had its cracks neatly filled by Dickon Nance, one of Hepworth's studio assistants, and he used slivers of elmwood. I think that was done when, or soon before, it was gifted to the Tate. And a couple of years later, Hepworth was asking Norman Reed how the fills were actually standing up. She did mind about cracks. There's a detail, and I think you could see down the centre there the sliver of elm that Nance inserted there. Nowadays, it's a collaborative decision between curators and conservators as whether to attempt to fill a split or leave it. Hopefully they're guided by the sensible principle of only doing as much as is necessary and as little as possible. I don't really mind the cracks in the wood, but the real enemy of wood is, of course, central heating. Hepworth's correct. That's the nature of wood. And at present, I think the Tate's loan policy, for example, asks between 40 to 60% RH in the room and no more than a plus or minus 10% change in 24 hours. It's pretty standard. But there are always pressures to reduce energy costs and to loosen the rules. So my question is, what sort of stability is really needed? Could the rules be more flexible, or should they be more stringent? And I'll come back to this in a moment. The Palais, across the road from the museum in St Ives, I thought this was a relatively recent photo until I blew it up and realised that's Hepworth in the background there, with a mallet on a stool. But it basically didn't change for at least 30, maybe 40 years. After Barbara's death, her family opened the studio to visitors and gifted it with many of her sculptures to the Tate Gallery in 1980. And that was a catalyst for establishing a sculpture conservation section at the Tate, and that's where I started back in 1984. The Palais doesn't have, and never had, as far as I know, central heating. It remained as a store for many of her works held by the estate. The mild coastal situation means high relative humidity, 85 to 90% year-round, and the woods had become acclimatized to these conditions. It put them at risk of splitting when displayed in normal heated gallery conditions, and to meet the demand for loans for the estate's large wooden sculptures, we attempted to re-acclimatize some of them very gradually by lowering the RH in makeshift polythene tents over, I'd have to say, several months. And I think that's river form there, and a figure in walnuts about to be encased. There's a dehumidifier, which we sort of gradually brought the RH down over quite a long time. But it was guesswork. And to be honest, it remains guesswork. We don't know how much change a wood sculpture can really tolerate in its moisture content change before mechanical damage occurs. And because cut timber is hygroscopic, its moisture content is closely related to the amount of moisture in the air, the relative humidity in relation to temperature. Moisture content varies by species as well and is unevenly distributed within the wood. It can take several years for cut timber's moisture content to equilibrate with the surroundings, and the thicker the log, the longer it takes. You always have to have a graph in a conservation talk. And this one, which was done on some new test pieces, actually confirms what we've sort of worked with, that when wood is acclimatized to round about 50%, it tolerates further changes best. That's the yellow area at the bottom there. But beyond that, bigger changes cause irreversible damage. Now, this was just done with a wood that I think it was red oak or something, and it was certainly not aged wood. It was not in any way typical of any of the sculptures we're thinking about. We know the figures for stress tests on pieces under experimental conditions, and they confirm the General Museum guidelines. Unfortunately, different woods, different shapes, different finishes all affect moisture loss and gain, and the cumulative effect of daily and seasonal cycling is becoming apparent on some of these sculptures. It's subtle, but as bonds between individual fibres are weakened, they disrupt the surface finish and the outer smoothness that Hepworth so valued. And a seated figure here, which I was looking at a few weeks ago in Paris, I noticed there are little details, like on the right arm, that where the surface is just erupting slightly. That may be to do with shellac finish on the wood, but these are slight changes, which, okay, it's nearly 90 years old, but it's going to get older and it's going to carry on changing. A way forward might be more applied research using, for example, acoustic emission and technology and strain gauges. These are sort of sophisticated baby alarms. It's a way of monitoring individual pieces so that we can anticipate change before they happen. And I think we're all familiar with the creaking of wood in old buildings or boats. And on a micro level, this happens whenever stress is applied to any solid material, but especially a complex one like wood. it's possible to monitor the sound of micromovement as wood fibres strain. And put crudely, a gentle murmur is okay, but if it rises towards a scream, then damage is imminent. Once the sensitivity of a sculpture has been characterised, we could have much more confidence in specifying its safe display conditions, and they might be broader than we expect. So to sum up, each piece of wood is unique and made more so by turning it into a uniquely shaped sculpture. That's a challenge for conservators because the starting point of any conservation operation is to understand the material, what it is and what its properties are. So identify and characterise, that would be a start. Thank you.
Hello. I feel, as Penelope sort of indicated, rather an interloper, both because I'm not an expert on Barbara Hepworth, but also because I'm about to talk about Henry Moore, which feels sort of kind of wrong. But I have done so very much with points of contact, points of commonality with Hepworth in mind, and I hope I managed to stick to time. So I'm starting with an image of both these artists very much under enormous bits of stone. Setting the scene rather with stone as something originary, both in their inspiration as a material, their background, their childhood. Of course, this is Moore is in Yorkshire and Hepworth in Cornwall. But also to suggest that landscape and this material may be core concerns to both artists. So it may be unsurprising then that both artists also found inspiration in prehistoric sites, in ancient sites, and for more particularly Stonehenge. In a bid to keep to time, I'm chopped out all the very long-winded quotes by Henry Moore. So if I seem to sort of jump from one thing to another, my apologies. Moore first visited Stonehenge in the autumn of 1921. He did so sort of more or less immediately after having kind of arrived in the south, in London, having come down from Leeds after his sort of initial art school training in Leeds. And he was so sort of eager and keen to visit this site that he couldn't even wait till the following morning. So he arrived in the evening and he just sort of rushed and went to visit to Stonehenge by moonlight. And he talks about this enlarging the distances, the depths and the distances seemed enormous to me. His sort of urgency to visit Stonehenge kind of was paralleled about 10 years later by Walter Gropius, who also rushed to see Stonehenge on the first weekend after settling in London in 1933. And, you know, his visit, like Gropius, is reflective of a wider interest in these sites. Stonehenge, just 3 years before Moore's visit, had been acquired for the nation and coincided, of course, with this interest, largely driven by new archaeological discoveries, stimulating this kind of mass taste for this particular strand of British history. I am coming on to the material of it, I promise. So the scientific kind of nature of a lot of the archaeological research relied in many cases on this very kind of dry, accurate illustrations in its publication. And it had to a certain extent sterilize the previously romantic images of these ancient sites in art. The enigmatic and the ineffable presence of Stonehenge, which had offered such kind of imaginative potential to artists for hundreds of years, was at risk of erosion. And artists of the 20th century recognized the site itself as a highly wrought work of art, a powerful form which provided wonder, and wrested this back into the realm of the artist as a model of authentic expression. And this was notably mediated through and used as a justification for abstraction. So these are some of the prints that Moore made much later, which I will actually return to. Just because of the exhibition upstairs, I've put in a Bill Brand photograph. It's got nothing to do with my talk, other than it's highly romantic and of an ancient site. The image on the left, however, is of Stonehenge, and are photographs that were included in Circle magazine. So the 1937 publication of Circle, the International Survey of Constructive Art, included photographs of Stonehenge on screen, which was sandwiched between a text by Barbara Hepworth and the contribution of 2 quotes by Henry Moore. It also included a text by Desmond Bernal, who wrote for Circle, and also to an introduction to the catalogue of Hepworth's exhibition of the same year. And he stated, "Neolithic art with its extreme formalism does not represent a primitive stage in the evolution of art, but an apparent step backwards, away from the admirable and living representations of the art of the cave painters. This backward step is illusionary, for Neolithic art is highly sophisticated and expresses the realization that important ideas can be conveyed by extremely limited symbolic forms." So Bernal's kind of comments are echoing a wider theory then, which is much expanded at the time, that these forms are sort of cyclical. There's no linear evolution between sort of abstract to realistic or figurative art. Indeed, the forms that were used by the artists of Circle were not novel or inhuman, but inevitable modes of expression employed over various phases of human experience, and as such, concentrated in their power. So the notion then of ancient stones as abstract form, primal not only in their shape but in their material, complemented the concurrent credo that was championed by many avant-garde artists, but particularly by Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth, of direct carving and truth to materials. This is by working directly with the stone and allowing its natural properties to emerge. Moore and Hepworth and other sculptors were, in a sense, bridging this ancient and modern world. They're sort of, by working with this resistance to the stone, this resistance to the material, Stokes even talks about this as a kind of rediscovery of the art of the ancients. The hard physical material of Stonehenge contributed to its atavistic, originary and perennial character, its placement and its surface evidencing the trace of an archaic artistic will, which had intensified through its accumulated purpose. It's the intuition of this purpose which informs early abstractions of Circle sculptors. I was going to talk now about this kind of parallel interest also in Europe, where these erratic boulders are being discussed and talked about by an art historian called Christian Furmeister. He sort of associates them with Picasso and with Brancusi, Giacometti, Arp, a number of sculptors who are also looking at these kind of ancient stones in Europe, but are also kind of doing so because they're apolitical, because of their abstract form, because of their natural form often. They were kind of offered apolitical modes of expression. And there's a very contrary sort of development going on in Germany, where the sort of same kind of stones, same kind of ancient sites are being recognized as sort of supposed justification for the heroic roots of the German nation, and embrace, of course, the same sense of this authentic substance, this ancient stone, to the extent that actually megalithic tombs in Germany were being kind of deconstructed and the material used to create memorial sculptures after the First World War. So there's this importance there in the material in terms of its significance. More profoundly comprehended this sort of dialectical engagement between past and present that Stonehenge presented, and he appreciated the forms as direct and elemental. But they also spoke of man and landscape, this transcendent counter to the otherwise transitory modern world. And it's in the 1970s then that he produces his first overtly sort of body of work which addresses the subject of Stonehenge. And it's notably done in a series of drawings and prints. Of course, these allow him to bathe those scenes in moonlight and fix that first image which he had retained in his mind for over 50 years. But it's on the page rather than in 3 dimensions that Moore kind of frees himself of the physicality of sculpture to create these illusionary spaces, which nonetheless sort of, it's a tangible, making tangible the memory. In the immediate aftermath of his 1921 visit, Moore was in the throes of his studies at the Royal College of Art in London. He's consumed with the plethora of ideas that are being suggested by the British Museum, the Science Museum, the Wallace Collection, Natural History Museum, much in the same way that Hepworth was also kind of consumed with this enormous amount of material and inspiration. So he's not making those kind of mimetic representational images of Stonehenge at all, not for 50 years. Instead, we see the impact of Stonehenge emerging in a number of drawings that kind of employ colour. We've talked a lot about colour today, and they're sort of almost surreal in their evocation of an imaginary landscape peopled by these sort of enigmatic stone figures, almost animate stone monoliths. And their collection within a landscape is really important. So the fantastical arrangement then of these stones found its actual counterpart in Moore's creation of his own kind of mini henge in the garden of Burcroft, a cottage that he bought in Kent in 1934. Expanding from his kind of cramped studio in London, he kept his London studio, but he would sort of weekend and summer holiday in Kent. Moore prized this outdoor space specifically as a space for carving. The blocks of stone yet to be worked were deliberately set against the landscape beyond. And I've got a number of these really beautiful early photographs taken by Moore of these works in Burcroft. And this sort of concurrent is a sketchbook page. From his sort of 5 to 6 sketchbook, in which you see him kind of actually drawing out this kind of arrangement of stones and being very careful to, to describe their material. Actually, he's listing these materials and these stone blocks. And it kind of seems to have been arrived at through this kind of combination of the sort of somatic experience of actually positioning blocks in stone in the garden of Burcroft, and this sort of way that he has in his sketchbooks at the time of ordering his thoughts. So the stones are not only listed in this diagram, but he was also kind of accompanied by the words intensity, big form, opposition of masses, which is twice underlined. Okay, I've really got to rush. So Moore's oscillating then between text and image in kind of digesting these experiences of Stonehenge. And it's really interesting for me in terms of an exhibition I've been working on recently, how often the word mass and opposition of mass or thrusting of masses also comes through these sketchbooks. Interestingly, he also cajoles himself to stay on the big design and the play of masses until power of form is achieved. And it's interesting to me in the context of this kind of conversation about material that it's on paper that he is initially working out these kind of ideas. Okay, I'm going to try and... So he doesn't actually make these sort of large-scale animate stone figures of that size. Of course, the blocks of stone that he was able to get and afford when he was sort of in the 20s and 30s were much smaller, and this sort of huge juxtaposition of towering stone figures doesn't actually occur until much later on. Maybe we can talk about the sort of animation of stone at some point in terms of figures in stone. But I'm going to jump forward to, I'm going to skip over this beautiful image of Moore's maze, which I wanted to use to talk about ideas moving off the page and into studio experiments where he's pushing bones and so on into clay in order to create these sort of imaginary landscapes in 3 dimensions. And then the culmination of these ideas, quite often to me, seems to find its idea not in stone or bronze, but to really learn the lessons of Stonehenge as a work or assemblage of works through which man can inhabit, can move between. He actually also relies on bronze. And there are sort of these, if Moore and Hepworth both talk about art in the landscape as a very, very core concern for their work. And it seems to me really important to think about this in terms of material and in terms of bronze, so that it's not just considered as natural material which sits into a landscape context in this really sort of seamless way, but actually these enormous pieces of bronze are announcing their artifice. Art is, of course, the anthem of nature, and this sort of by placing a large work like this in the landscape, it causes one to pause, it causes one to notice, to circumrotate, to take their time in doing so, to navigate those interstices between works. And it's this sort of core lesson that is achieved, that seems to have been carried forward from Stonehenge. And it's this freezing in time. And I say this really loose now, because having heard Laura's paper, I sort of wanted to announce that bronze was sort of like a way of freezing the erosion of the stone, but actually, of course, it has its own kind of erosion to kind of deal with. But there seems something important about a shift from stone to bronze in order to do these, to kind of expand on those lessons learnt from Stonehenge, so that it wasn't actually all about kind of carving, which was so important in the 30s, but there's a continuation there, for which bronze is really the material from which he can kind of expand on those early ideas.